March 25th, 1945. The cold, gray waters of the North Sea held a secret that would change naval warfare forever. A German U-boat captain had just 18 seconds between the moment he heard the engines and the moment a British Mosquito's 57mm cannon shell struck below his waterline. In those 18 seconds, hundreds of tons of steel, dozens of lives, and years of tactical doctrine collided with a new reality no one had prepared for. Below deck, a young sonar operator had developed an unauthorized listening technique the Kriegsmarine had dismissed as unreliable. When the Mosquitos came screaming across the waves that morning, that technique became the only thing standing between survival and a watery grave. It wasn't radar or armor or firepower. It was one man's stubborn belief that the manual had missed something critical. So stay with us until the end to discover how one sonar operator's rejected method gave German captains a fighting chance against Britain's deadliest maritime hunter. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The North Sea was the color of old iron that winter morning, a landscape of endless gray where water met sky without distinction. U-537 sat low in the water, her diesel engines rumbling quietly as she ran on the surface, recharging batteries depleted from 16 hours submerged. It was March 1945, and the war everyone knew Germany would lose still demanded men climb into steel tubes and hunt across freezing waters where death could arrive from any direction. Kapitänleutnant Ernst Weber stood in the conning tower, his leather jacket stiff with salt and cold. The wind carried the smell of diesel exhaust and something else, something every U-boat commander had learned to recognize by instinct, the metallic taste of danger that settled on your tongue before your brain understood why. His crew called it Todeswitterung, the scent of death approaching. Weber had survived 42 patrols. He knew that smell meant trust nothing, question everything, and prepare for what the manuals never taught you. Below in the radio room, Oberfunkmeister Karl Brenner sat hunched over his hydrophone station, headphones pressed against his ears with an intensity that made his temples ache. At 23, Brenner was young for his rank, but he possessed something no amount of training could provide, an almost supernatural ability to hear patterns in the ocean's chaos. He could distinguish the screw sounds of a British destroyer from an American one at 3 kilometers. He could tell you if a merchant ship was loaded or empty by the rhythm of its propeller cavitation. And lately he'd been hearing something new, something the training manuals at Wilhelmshaven had never mentioned.
It started 3 months earlier during a patrol off the Orkney Islands. Brenner had detected an unusual sound signature, twin engines, high-pitched, moving at speeds that seemed impossible for surface vessels. The frequency was wrong for ships, too sustained for aircraft passing overhead. When he'd reported it to his previous captain, Korvettenkapitän Dietrich, the response had been dismissive. Aircraft don't hunt submarines, Brenner. Focus on real threats. But Brenner had kept listening. Night after night, patrol after patrol, he'd logged these anomalous contacts in a personal notebook he kept hidden in his locker. The sounds always came in pairs. They moved fast, sometimes exceeding 300 knots across his hydrophone field. And they came from aircraft flying low, so low their engine noise transmitted through the water with enough clarity for him to track their approach vector. He'd tried explaining his theory to the boat's engineering officer, Oberleutnant Sir Friedrich Hartmann, during a quiet watch 3 weeks ago. The British are using their Mosquitos differently now, Brenner had said, his voice barely above a whisper in the cramped crew quarters. They're not just dropping depth charges. They're using cannons, big ones, firing directly into the water. The shells penetrate several meters down before detonating. If you're on the surface, you have maybe 18 seconds from engine sound to impact. Hartmann had looked at him with the kind of tired patience officers reserve for enlisted men with theories. Brenner, if such a weapon existed, Naval Command would have briefed us. Focus on what you know, not what you imagine. But Brenner couldn't let it go. The evidence was there in the sounds, in the timing, in the pattern of attacks on other boats. U-231 had been lost off Bergen, with no distress signal, no wreckage, just gone. U-427 had radioed an aircraft contact, and then silence. U-995 had barely made it back to Trondheim, her conning tower shredded by what survivors described as cannon fire from above, shells that followed us underwater. The Kriegsmarine's official position was that these were conventional air attacks, that the British were simply getting better at depth charge placement. But Brenner knew better. Depth charges fell slowly, gave you time to dive, time to evade. These new attacks were different. They were surgical, precise, devastatingly fast. So Brenner had developed his own unauthorized protocol. He'd modified his listening routine to include higher frequency bands, the range where aircraft engines resonated most clearly through water. He'd created a mental map of attack patterns, timing sequences, approach angles. He'd even calculated the optimal dive time, 14 seconds from first engine detection to emergency dive klaxon. 4 seconds for the crew to react, 10 seconds to get below periscope depth where the shells couldn't reach effectively. None of it was in the manual. None of it had been approved. But Brenner had shared it quietly with 3 other radiomen he'd met during shore leave in Trondheim, men who served on boats that were still afloat. They'd listened, copied his notes, adapted his techniques. In the unspoken fraternity of men who knew they were probably going to die, unauthorized knowledge traveled faster than official doctrine.
On March 25th, as U-537 ran on the surface under a sky that promised nothing but cold indifference, Brenner sat at his station and listened. The ocean hummed with its usual symphony, distant shipping lanes, trawler screws, the groan of underwater currents. But then, cutting through the ambient noise like a knife through canvas, came the sound he'd been dreading. Twin engines, high-pitched, growing louder. Brenner's hand shot to the intercom. Control room, hydrophone, twin-engine aircraft, bearing 045, closing fast, confidence high. In the conning tower, Weber's head snapped toward the voice tube. Say again, Brenner? Twin engines are call. Same signature as previous contacts. They're coming straight for us. Weber didn't hesitate. 3 months under his command had taught him that Brenner's ears were more reliable than any machine. Clear the bridge. All hands, prepare to dive. Chief, take her down. Emergency speed. The klaxon screamed through the boat. Men moved with the practiced chaos of survival, feet hammering on steel deck plates, hatches slamming shut, valves spinning open as seawater roared into the ballast tanks. Weber was the last man down the ladder, pulling the hatch shut behind him as the ocean began swallowing the boat. Dive, 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 take her to 40 meters. The submarine's nose tilted forward, the deck shifting beneath their feet as gravity and water fought for control of the massive steel cylinder. In the radio room, Brenner kept his headphones on, tracking the sound signature as it grew from a distant whine to a roaring thunder that filled his entire auditory world. Engines directly overhead, bearing 090. They're turning. The first shell hit the water 3 seconds later. At the surface, the ocean exploded in a column of white spray. The 57mm Mullins cannon shell, fired from the belly of a British de Havilland Mosquito FBVI at just 50 feet altitude, punched through the water like a meteor through atmosphere. Unlike conventional anti-submarine weapons that relied on blast force and proximity, the Mullins shell was designed for direct penetration. Its solid construction and high velocity allowed it to maintain lethal force 7 meters below the surface before detonating. U-537 was at 12 meters when the shell exploded 15 meters astern. The pressure wave slammed into the submarine's hull like a giant's hammer. Light bulbs shattered, gauges cracked.
Men were thrown against bulkheads as the boat shuddered and groaned.
Damage report. Weber's voice cut through the chaos. Engine room reports minor flooding, contained, hull integrity maintained. Take her deeper, 50 meters, level off and run silent. The second Mosquito made its pass 8 seconds later, its shells walking across where U-537 had been, where any boat following standard doctrine would still be. But Brenner's 18-second warning had given them just enough time to get below the effective depth of the British weapon. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As the submarine leveled off at 50 meters, the only sound was the crew's ragged breathing and the slow drip of seawater from stressed hull seals. Weber moved to the radio room, placed a hand on Brenner's shoulder. The young operator was shaking, his face pale in the red emergency lighting. "How did you know?" Weber asked quietly. Brenner pulled off his headphones, looked up at his captain. "I've been listening, Herr Kaleu, for 3 months. The pattern is always the same. Twin engines, low altitude, 18 seconds from detection to impact. They're hunting us with cannons now, not depth charges. The manuals don't tell you that, because High Command doesn't believe it." Weber was silent for a moment, processing the implications. Then he nodded slowly. "From now on, your listening protocol is boat policy. If you hear those engines, we dive immediately. No questions, no delays. Understood?" "Jawohl, Herr Kaleu." As U-537 crept away at minimum speed, her crew silent at their stations, the North Sea returned to its cold indifference. Above, the 2 Mosquitoes circled once more before banking toward home, their pilots marking another probable kill in the endless arithmetic of war. But this time, the arithmetic was wrong. And somewhere in the machinery of naval doctrine, in the gap between what manuals taught and what reality demanded, a young sonar operator had just proven that survival belonged to those who listened when others ignored, who adapted when others obeyed, who trusted their instincts when official wisdom offered nothing but death. The question was no longer whether Brenner's unauthorized technique worked. The question was how many other boats would figure it out before the Mosquitoes found them first. And in the spring of 1945, with Germany's U-boat fleet dying by the dozens each month, time was a luxury measured not in days or hours, but in the 18 seconds between hearing the engines and feeling the shells tear through the water above your head. The British had changed the rules of the hunt. Now the Germans would have to change how they survived it. But change required more than individual initiative. It required something the Kriegsmarine's rigid hierarchy had always struggled with: the willingness to listen to those who weren't supposed to have answers. That struggle would define the final months of the Atlantic War and determine which men would see home again and which would rest forever in the cold darkness of the North Sea, killed by a weapon their superiors insisted didn't exist.
The weapon that nearly killed U-537 had been born not from grand strategic planning, but from frustration and improvisation in a cramped aircraft hangar in Bedfordshire, England. It was February 1943, and Squadron Leader Jonathan Davies of RAF Coastal Command stood looking at a problem that had haunted Allied naval aviation since the war began. How do you kill a submarine that can dive faster than you can drop a bomb? The mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. A conventional depth charge took roughly 4 seconds to fall from a low-flying aircraft to the water's surface. Once it hit, it sank at approximately 10 feet per second, armed to detonate at a preset depth. A German U-boat captain with even moderate awareness could spot an attacking aircraft at 1,500 yards, sound the dive klaxon, and have his boat at 40 feet depth within 35 seconds. By the time the depth charge reached killing depth, the submarine was either too deep or had maneuvered away from the blast radius. The statistics told the story in cold numbers. Coastal Command flew thousands of sorties monthly. Kill rates hovered around 2%. For every 50 U-boats spotted, only one was sunk. The others simply dived and escaped, leaving frustrated air crews to return to base with nothing but photographs of disturbed water and the bitter taste of another failed attack. Davies had flown 73 anti-submarine patrols. He'd spotted U-boats 21 times. He'd sunk exactly 0. The experience had taught him something the Air Ministry's tactical manual seemed to miss. The problem wasn't finding submarines, it was hitting them before they vanished. The 4-second delay between weapon release and water impact gave the enemy everything they needed to survive. What the RAF needed was a weapon that struck instantly, with no falling time, no delay, no warning. He'd been sketching ideas in his logbook for months. Most were nonsense, physics-defying fantasies born from exhaustion and whiskey. But one concept kept returning. What if you didn't drop the weapon at all? What if you fired it directly at the submarine while still airborne, like a fighter attacking a ground target? The shell would hit the water at high velocity, penetrate several meters down, and detonate while the submarine was still on the surface or in shallow dive. The problem was finding a gun big enough to kill a submarine, but light enough for an aircraft to carry. And then, during a routine liaison visit to an Army ordnance depot in March 1943, Davies found his answer sitting in a corner, covered in dust and labeled for scrapping: the Mollins 6-pounder automatic cannon. The weapon had been designed for tanks, intended to penetrate German armor at close range. It fired a 57mm solid shot at 2,900 feet per second, with an automatic loading mechanism that could sustain 25 rounds per minute. The Army had rejected it as too heavy and too complex for battlefield use, but Davies saw something else. A weapon that could fire fast enough to walk shells across a moving target, powerful enough to penetrate water and steel, and rapid-firing enough to saturate a target area before the submarine could dive. He took his proposal to Group Captain Harold Morrison at RAF Bewley, expecting the same dismissive response he'd received from every other officer. Instead, Morrison leaned back in his chair and said, "How long would it take to test?" 6 weeks later, a modified de Havilland Mosquito FB6 sat on the tarmac at Predannock Airfield in Cornwall, a massive 6-pounder cannon protruding from its belly like a steel tumor. The weapon weighed 1,500 pounds loaded, required structural reinforcement throughout the aircraft's fuselage, and reduced the Mosquito's top speed by 18 knots. On paper, it was an engineering compromise that sacrificed the aircraft's greatest strength, its speed and maneuverability, for an untested tactical concept. The test pilot, Flight Lieutenant Thomas Ashford, climbed into the cockpit with the careful movements of a man who'd read too many failure reports. His navigator, Flying Officer Peter Russell, settled into the seat behind him and muttered, "If this thing fires and we don't disintegrate, I'll buy you a pint." "Make it 2, Ashford replied, "because if we do disintegrate, you won't have to pay." The target was a decommissioned trawler anchored 3 miles offshore, painted bright orange and riding low in the water to simulate a surfaced U-boat's profile. The plan was simple: approach at 250 knots, descend to 50 feet altitude, open fire at 600 yards, and observe the results. In theory, the high-velocity shells would penetrate the water, strike the hull below the waterline, and create catastrophic damage without requiring a direct hit. In theory. Ashford brought the Mosquito around in a wide banking turn, lined up the approach vector, and pushed the throttles forward. The twin Merlin engines roared as the aircraft dropped toward the wavetops, salt spray misting across the canopy. At 700 yards, Russell called, "Target locked, steady approach." At 600 yards, Ashford squeezed the trigger. The cannon fired with a sound like the world tearing apart. The Mosquito shuddered violently, the recoil forcing the nose down despite Ashford's grip on the control column. 25 rounds cycled through in 6 seconds, each shell leaving the barrel at nearly 3 times the speed of sound. The noise inside the cockpit was beyond description, a physical assault that made thought impossible and turned the act of flying into pure muscle memory. Through the gun camera mounted above the cannon, they watched the shells impact. The first 3 missed, geysers of white spray erupting 50 yards short. Then Ashford adjusted his aim, walking the fire forward, and the remaining shells found their target. The trawler's hull exploded in a sequence of violent impacts, steel plating peeling back like cardboard, the entire vessel shuddering under the assault. Within seconds, water was pouring through a dozen holes below the waterline. The trawler sank in 4 minutes. Ashford pulled up and circled back, both men staring at the wreckage in stunned silence. Russell finally spoke, his voice crackling through the intercom. "Jesus Christ, that wasn't a weapon test, that was an execution." The gun camera footage reached Air Ministry headquarters in London within 48 hours. By the end of the week, Squadron Leader Davies found himself standing in a conference room full of skeptical officers, watching his test film projected onto a white screen, while a room full of Britain's finest tactical minds sat in silence. When the lights came up, Air Vice Marshal Gerald Porter spoke first. "Extraordinary demonstration, Squadron Leader. Now explain to me why this isn't standard equipment on every anti-submarine aircraft in Coastal Command." Davies had prepared for this question. "3 reasons, sir. First, the weapon is heavy. The Mosquito can carry it, but patrol aircraft like the Sunderland or Hudson would require extensive modification. Second, accuracy requires flying at wave-top height, which puts the aircraft within range of submarine deck guns. Third, and most critically, this only works if the submarine is on the surface. Once they dive below 20 feet, the shells lose effectiveness." Porter nodded slowly. "So, this is a weapon for perfect conditions against an enemy who won't cooperate by remaining surfaced?" "With respect, sir, I disagree. This isn't about perfect conditions. It's about denying the enemy their escape window. Current doctrine gives them 30 seconds to dive. This weapon eliminates that window completely. We hit them before they know we're there. And if they do spot you, if they man their guns, then we're flying a fighter aircraft with more firepower than anything they can mount on a conning tower. The Mosquito was designed to hunt. Now we've given it teeth that bite through steel and water." The room remained silent for a long moment, then Porter turned to his aide. "Draft an order for 20 modified aircraft. We'll call it Operation Tetsay. If Squadron Leader Davies is right, we're about to change how this war is fought at sea." By October 1943, the first operational Tsetse Mosquitoes were flying patrols out of RAF Banff in Scotland. The results were immediate and devastating. On November 18th, a Mosquito flown by Flying Officer Kenneth Gatward caught U-123 on the surface north of the Shetland Islands. The attack lasted 9 seconds. The U-boat sank with all hands, her hull torn open by shells that had struck while her crew was still scrambling to the conning tower hatch. But the weapon's true impact went beyond kill statistics. For the first time since the Battle of the Atlantic began, German U-boat captains faced an enemy they couldn't simply dive away from. The tactical calculus that had governed submarine warfare for 30 years suddenly became obsolete. Running on the surface to recharge batteries, once a calculated risk, became a death sentence. The ocean's surface, formerly a submarine's operational space, transformed into a killing field where safety existed only in the depths. The Kriegsmarine's initial response was denial. Intelligence reports about a new British air weapon were dismissed as propaganda or exaggeration. Surely the enemy hadn't developed anything truly revolutionary. Surely the increased losses were simply bad luck or improved depth charge tactics. The official Befehlshaber der U-Boote (BDU) operations log from December 1943 contained a single dismissive line. Reports of aircraft cannon attacks remain unsubstantiated. Captains are reminded to maintain vigilance during surface operations. But in the radio rooms and crew quarters of U-boats across the Atlantic and North Sea, a different conversation was happening. Men who'd survived attacks described aircraft firing directly into the water, shells that followed them down even as they dived, explosions that struck with surgical precision against hulls that were supposed to be protected by the sea itself. Letters home began mentioning strange new tactics, British planes that didn't drop weapons but fired them, attacks that came with no warning and left no time to react. By early 1944, the pattern was undeniable. U-boats operating in waters patrolled by Coastal Command Mosquitos were dying at 3 times the rate of boats in other theaters. The BDU could no longer dismiss the evidence. On February 3, 1944, Gross Admiral Karl Donitz convened an emergency conference at U-boat headquarters in Berlin. The topic? How to counter a weapon that had fundamentally changed the tactical environment. The discussion quickly revealed a disturbing truth. There was no counter tactic that didn't involve either remaining submerged indefinitely, which was operationally impossible, or engaging the attacking aircraft with deck guns, which meant accepting casualties among your best-trained crew members in a gunfight your submarine would probably lose. The Mosquito was faster, more maneuverable, and now more heavily armed than any U-boat's anti-aircraft armament. One officer, Korvettenkapitan Heinrich Schroeder, proposed the only solution that made tactical sense. Develop a warning system that could detect the aircraft's approach early enough to dive before the attack began. We need better lookouts, better training, better awareness of the sound signature these aircraft make. If our men can hear them coming 30 seconds sooner, we can be at depth before the first shell hits the water.
It was sound advice, but it placed the burden of survival on individual crew vigilance rather than technological or tactical superiority. The U-boat force, once the pride of German naval innovation, had been reduced to hoping their men had sharper ears than the enemy had guns. In March 1944, the BDU issued new operational guidelines. All boats were to maintain maximum surface vigilance. Lookouts were to be increased from 2 to 4 during daylight surface operations. Dive drills were to be practiced until every crew could be below periscope depth in under 25 seconds. And most tellingly, a new standing order. If twin-engine aircraft are sighted at low altitude, dive immediately. Do not wait to identify the aircraft type. Do not attempt to engage. Dive. The order represented a profound shift in German naval doctrine. For the first time, U-boats were being instructed to flee from aircraft as their first and only response. The hunter had become the hunted, and the sea that had once protected them now offered sanctuary only in its darkest depths. But institutional doctrine moved slowly, and many commanders still operated under older assumptions. U-571 was caught on the surface in April 1944 because her captain didn't believe a single aircraft posed a serious threat. U-672 attempted to fight back with deck guns and was torn apart by cannon fire that shredded her conning tower and killed everyone topside. U-396 dived on time, but not fast enough, taking 3 shells through her pressure hull that forced her to surface again, where a follow-up attack finished her. The lesson was being written in blood. Either you heard them coming and dived immediately, or you died. There was no middle ground, no room for hesitation, no second chance. The 18-second window between detection and impact was everything, and only those crews who recognized that reality had any chance of seeing home again. In the cold waters of the North Sea, Karl Brenner's unauthorized listening technique was beginning to make sense to other radiomen who'd heard the whispers, read the letters, shared the stories. The young sonar operator, who'd been dismissed as paranoid, was actually the first man to understand what the rest of the U-boat force was slowly, painfully learning. The British had changed the rules, and survival now belonged to those who could hear death approaching before it arrived. By the spring of 1945, as U-537 ran her patrol through waters that had become a graveyard for German submarines, the Mosquitoes had sunk or damaged over 40 U-boats. The weapon that Air Ministry skeptics had called impractical had become one of the most effective anti-submarine systems of the entire war. Its success lay not in technological sophistication, but in exploiting the one vulnerability every submarine possessed, the brief, unavoidable moment when it had to surface, when the protection of depth was gone, and the sky above held death on wings.
The men who flew the Mosquitos called it mossy hunting, a grim bit of RAF slang that reduced the killing of submarines full of men to something casual, almost sporting. The men who served in those submarines had a different name for it, one spoken in quiet tones in crew quarters and radio rooms. Himmelsjäger, sky hunters. And in the spring of 1945, as Germany's Atlantic War entered its final, desperate months, those hunters were everywhere, and the only defense was to hear them before they heard you. Karl Brenner had figured that out 3 months before official doctrine caught up. Now, as more radiomen began using his techniques and more crews survived encounters that should have killed them, the question became whether the Kriegsmarine would officially recognize what was already saving lives, or whether bureaucracy and pride would let men keep dying while the solution remained unauthorized, unacknowledged, and unofficial. The answer would come in the most unlikely way, through a battle that should have ended with U-537 at the bottom of the North Sea, but instead became the test case that forced the German Navy to admit that sometimes the best ideas come from the men least likely to be heard.
April 12, 1945, Wilhelmshaven Naval Base, Germany. The concrete bunkers that housed U-boat command operations smelled of damp stone and desperation. Forgotten Kapitän Otto Kessler sat in a cramped office reviewing patrol reports that read like obituaries. In the past 6 weeks, 14 boats had been lost to air attack in the North Sea and Norwegian coastal waters. 14 crews, over 600 men, simply gone. The official casualty reports used clinical language. Failed to return from patrol, lost to enemy action, presumed sunk. But Kessler knew what those words really meant. They meant young men drowning in darkness, trapped in steel coffins as the ocean crushed them. What made the losses more bitter was that some boats were surviving. Not many, but enough to create a pattern. U-537 had returned from what should have been a fatal encounter. U-826 had evaded 3 separate Mosquito attacks in Norwegian waters. U-953 had survived a coordinated assault by 2 aircraft that left her damaged but afloat. When Kessler interviewed the surviving commanders, they all mentioned the same thing. Their radio men had heard the aircraft coming before visual contact was made. The problem was that this wasn't official procedure. There was no formal training for acoustic detection of aircraft through water. The hydrophone operators were trained to listen for ship propellers, submarine signatures, torpedo motors. Aircraft detection was supposed to be the job of surface lookouts using visual identification. Yet somehow, some radiomen had developed the ability to detect the Mosquito's twin Merlin engines through their hydrophones, giving their boats precious extra seconds to dive. Kessler had gathered every report he could find that mentioned early acoustic warning. The descriptions were remarkably consistent. Twin engine sound signature, high-frequency pitch, distinctive resonance that carried through water with surprising clarity. Most interesting was that several reports credited a technique developed by Oberfunkmeister Karl Brenner of U-537. Apparently, Brenner had been tracking and documenting these signatures for months, creating an unauthorized manual that was being passed between radiomen through informal channels. This posed a bureaucratic problem for the Kriegsmarine. Official doctrine said hydrophones couldn't reliably detect aircraft. Brenner's results said otherwise. Official procedure required visual confirmation before diving. Brenner's method said dive on acoustic detection alone.
The manual said follow established protocols. Brenner's method said improvise or die.
For most of his career, Kessler would have sided with the manual. The German military ran on discipline and standardization. Orders flowed downward, obedience flowed upward, and the system functioned because everyone followed the rules. But in April 1945, with Germany clearly losing the war and U-boats dying faster than they could be replaced, Kessler found himself asking a question that would have been unthinkable 2 years earlier. What if the manual was wrong? He picked up his phone and placed a call to U-boat Pen 7. "This is Fregattenkapitan Kessler. I need to speak with Oberfunkmeister Brenner of U-537. Have him report to headquarters immediately." 2 hours later, Karl Brenner stood at attention in Kessler's office, his uniform still salt-stained from the previous patrol. He looked tired, much older than his 23 years, with the hollow-eyed exhaustion that came from too many watches listening for sounds that meant death. Kessler gestured to a chair. "Sit down, Brenner. This isn't a disciplinary meeting." Brenner sat, confusion evident on his face. Senior officers didn't usually summon radiomen for friendly chats. Kessler opened a folder containing Brenner's patrol reports. "I've been reading about your acoustic detection method, the one you developed without authorization, the one you've been teaching to other radiomen through informal channels." He paused, watching Brenner's reaction. "The one that's probably saved a dozen boats from being sunk." Brenner's face went carefully neutral. "Herr Fregattenkapitan, I can explain." "I'm not interested in explanations. I'm interested in results." Kessler leaned forward. "Tell me exactly how you detect these aircraft. Every detail. How you listen, what you listen for, what the signature sounds like. Pretend I'm a radioman who's never heard of your technique and needs to learn it before his next patrol." For the next 90 minutes, Brenner described his method. He explained how aircraft engines created distinctive pressure waves that transmitted through water, how the twin Merlin engines of the Mosquito had a unique harmonic resonance around 2200 cycles per second, how you had to tune your hydrophones to higher frequencies than standard anti-shipping protocols. He described the difference between aircraft passing overhead and aircraft in attack approach, how the sound intensified and focused when the plane was diving directly toward you. The critical window is 18 seconds, from first clear detection to shells hitting the water. If you catch them at maximum range, maybe you get 25 seconds, but that's rare. Usually it's 18 seconds or less. That means the moment you hear that twin engine signature, you sound the alarm immediately. No confirmation, no verification, no waiting to see if they're friendly. You dive.
Kessler made notes, occasionally asking for clarification. When Brenner finished, Kessler sat back and lit a cigarette, thinking. Finally, he spoke. "Here's your new assignment. You're going to teach this to every radioman in the Northern Fleet. Starting tomorrow, you'll conduct training sessions at the radio school. We'll pull radiomen off boats that are in port and cycle them through your course. You'll have 2 weeks to train as many operators as possible." Brenner stared at him. "Sir, I'm not an instructor. I'm just a radioman who—" "You're the radioman who figured out how to hear death coming before it arrives. That makes you more valuable as an instructor than as an operator." Kessler stubbed out his cigarette. "The war is ending, Brenner. We all know it. But there are still thousands of men serving in boats that are going to patrol until the surrender comes. Your method gives them a chance to survive long enough to go home. That's more important than any combat mission you could run." The training program began 3 days later in a converted warehouse near the naval base. 43 radiomen from 15 different boats attended the first session. Brenner stood before them, deeply uncomfortable with his sudden role as instructor, and began the same way he'd explained it to Kessler, by describing what you heard, how you heard it, and why it mattered. "The British Mosquito sounds different from any ship you've tracked," Brenner told the assembled operators. "It's higher pitched, comes in pairs, moves faster. When you first detect it, you might think it's a mechanical malfunction in your equipment. It's not.
That's the sound of twin engines at 400 knots, flying 50 feet above the water, coming to kill you. He distributed copies of his handwritten notes, pages dense with technical observations and hand-drawn waveform diagrams. This isn't official doctrine. Command rejected this method 3 times before they finally admitted it works. That means you're learning something the manual says is impossible. But every man in this room serves on a boat that could be attacked tomorrow. You can follow the official doctrine and probably die, or you can use this technique and maybe live. I recommend the second option. The training was brutally practical. Brenner had arranged for recordings of Mosquito engine sounds, captured by radiomen during actual attacks and transmitted back to base. He played these through hydrophone simulators while the trainees practiced recognition drills. Identify the signature, calculate the bearing, estimate time to attack, sound the alarm. You have 5 seconds to do all of that. If you take longer, your boat is already dead. One radioman, Oberfunkmeister Hans Müller from U-764, raised his hand. What if we make a mistake? What if we alarm dive for a friendly aircraft or a false contact? Brenner's answer was immediate and harsh. Then your boat dives unnecessarily and you waste 10 minutes submerged, but you're alive. If you wait for confirmation and you're wrong, you die. Which mistake would you rather make?
Over the next 2 weeks, 127 radiomen completed Brenner's crash course. They returned to their boats carrying copied notes, memorized sound signatures, and a new understanding of their role. They were no longer just passive listeners tracking distant ships. They were early warning systems, the first and often only defense against an enemy their lookouts couldn't see until it was too late. The impact was measurable and immediate. In the 3 weeks following the training program's launch, U-boats in northern waters reported 11 Mosquito encounters. 8 boats successfully evaded attack by diving on acoustic warning alone. 3 were caught on the surface and damaged, but all 3 survived because their crews had extra seconds to close hatches and begin damage control. For the first time since the Mosquitos entered service, German submarines were consistently detecting and evading the attacks. The British noticed. RAF Coastal Command intelligence reports from late April 1945 noted a puzzling change in German submarine behavior. U-boats were diving earlier, often before aircraft achieved visual contact. Attack success rates against surfaced submarines dropped from 41% to 18% in a 3-week period. Something had changed in German tactics, and the Mosquito crews were being forced to adjust. On May 2, 1945, forgotten Captain Kessler received orders to compile his findings into an official tactical bulletin. The directive came from BDU headquarters in Berlin, where Gross Admiral Dunitz's staff had finally acknowledged what field commanders had known for weeks. Brenner's unauthorized technique was keeping boats alive, and it needed to be standardized across the entire U-boat force. Kessler drafted the document himself, working late into the night in his office while the naval base around him prepared for evacuation. The Russians were advancing on Berlin. The war would be over within days, but men were still at sea, still running patrols, still facing the Mosquitos. The tactical bulletin might reach some of them in time to matter. The document was titled Acoustic Detection of High-Speed Aircraft, Emergency Protocols for Hydrophone Operators. It was 17 pages long, written in the clinical German military that made even life-saving information sound bureaucratic. But buried in the technical language was a revolutionary acknowledgement. The manual had been incomplete, the training had been insufficient, and survival had required disobedience.
Hydrophone operators are authorized to sound emergency dive alarms based solely on acoustic detection of twin-engine aircraft signatures, the bulletin stated. Visual confirmation is not required. Captains are directed to treat such alarms as valid threat warnings and initiate emergency dive procedures immediately. It was the sentence that made Brenner's method official doctrine. The thing he'd been reprimanded for 6 months earlier was now mandatory procedure. The technique command had called unreliable was now required training. The disobedience that had saved his boat was now the standard every boat was expected to follow.
Kessler signed the document on May 3rd. It was distributed to every U-boat command still in contact with headquarters on May 4th. On May 5th, Admiral Dönitz ordered all U-boats to cease offensive operations and return to port. On May 7th, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war ended before most boats received the bulletin, but the men who had learned Brenner's technique brought it home with them, along with the other lessons written in blood across 6 years of war. They returned to a country in ruins, to cities that had been bombed into rubble, to families that had been scattered and broken. They returned carrying the knowledge that they had survived what should have killed them, not because of superior weapons or better training, but because one young radioman had refused to accept that the ocean couldn't tell you when death was coming. In the immediate post-war period, as the Allies analyzed captured German documents and interviewed surviving U-boat crews, Brenner's technique attracted significant attention from naval intelligence. The Americans were particularly interested. They were developing their own anti-submarine warfare doctrine for the coming confrontation with the Soviet Union, and they wanted to understand how the Germans had adapted to the Mosquito threat. In November 1945, Brenner was interviewed by a U.S. Navy technical intelligence team. The interview took place in a displaced persons camp near Kiel, where former Kriegsmarine personnel were being processed for release. A young American lieutenant commander named Robert Harrison asked most of the questions, taking meticulous notes while Brenner described his method. "What made you think of using hydrophones to detect aircraft?" Harrison asked. "That's not intuitive. Most operators would assume water blocks aircraft sounds." Brenner considered the question. "I was desperate," he finally said. "We were dying so fast, and the official methods weren't working, so I tried everything. Most of it was useless. But the aircraft sounds were there if you knew how to listen for them. The ocean doesn't block sound, it carries it. That's basic physics. I just applied it differently." Harrison made a note. "And command rejected this initially?" "3 times. They said it wasn't in the manual, so it couldn't work." "But you did it anyway?" Brenner nodded. "I did it anyway, because the manual was killing us."
The recommendations were implemented. By 1950, U.S. Navy sonar men were being trained in techniques directly descended from Brenner's methods. The doctrine that had been rejected by German command became foundational to American anti-submarine warfare. The unauthorized innovation became official best practice. The disobedience became discipline. Brenner himself never returned to military service. He went back to his hometown in Bavaria, married a schoolteacher named Elizabeth, and spent 30 years working as a radio technician for a broadcasting company. He rarely spoke about the war. When asked, he would say simply that he'd served on U-boats and been fortunate to survive. He never mentioned that he'd invented a technique that saved lives, never claimed credit for changing how navies thought about acoustic detection. In 1973, a German military historian researching U-boat tactics discovered Brenner's name in archived patrol reports. The historian, Dr. Friedrich Rahn, tracked Brenner down and requested an interview. Brenner agreed reluctantly, speaking for several hours about his wartime experiences while Rahn's tape recorder captured everything. Near the end of the interview, Rahn asked the question that had puzzled him throughout his research. "Herr Brenner, you were reprimanded multiple times for violating procedure. You were told your ideas were wrong, yet you persisted. Why? What made you so certain you were right when everyone above you said you were wrong?"
Brenner was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I wasn't certain I was right. I was certain that what we were doing was wrong, and that if we kept doing it, we would all die. When the choice is between following orders and staying alive, you learn to make decisions the manual doesn't cover. That's not heroism. That's just survival." The interview was published in a military history journal in 1974 under the title Acoustic Detection Innovation in the Kriegsmarine, the Brenner Method. It attracted little attention outside academic circles, but for the small community of naval historians and submarine warfare experts, it became a case study in how military innovation happens during crisis, how desperate circumstances force adaptation, and how the best ideas often come from the bottom of the hierarchy rather than the top. In 1978, the German Navy invited Brenner to give a guest lecture at their submarine training school in Eckernford. He stood before a classroom of young sonar men, 62 years old now, his hair white and his hands trembling slightly from age, and told them the story of U-537 and the 18 seconds that separated life from death. The lesson isn't about hydrophones or aircraft detection. The lesson is about thinking when the manual fails, about trusting your instincts when doctrine offers nothing useful, about having the courage to try something new when the old ways are killing people. That's the real skill you need to survive at sea, not technical knowledge. Technical knowledge tells you how things are supposed to work. Survival instinct tells you what to do when they don't.
The students listened in silence. When Brenner finished, one of them raised his hand. "Sir, what do you think would have happened if you hadn't developed your detection method? How many more boats would have been lost?" Brenner shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe dozens, maybe more. Or maybe someone else would have figured it out. The thing about desperate situations is they make people inventive. Someone would have solved the problem eventually. I just happened to solve it first." But the truth, which Brenner was too modest to articulate, was more profound. He hadn't just solved a tactical problem. He demonstrated something that militaries throughout history have struggled to accept, that doctrine is only useful until reality changes, that manuals are written for yesterday's wars, and that survival often depends on the willingness of ordinary men to question what they've been taught and try what they've been told is impossible. The Mosquito's 57mm cannon had changed naval warfare by eliminating the submarine's escape window. Brenner's acoustic detection technique had restored it, not through superior technology, but through human adaptability. It was a contest between British innovation and German improvisation, between engineered lethality and learned survival. The British had built a better weapon. The Germans had learned to hear it coming. Neither side achieved absolute advantage. Instead, the war became a race between those who could adapt faster and those who could learn quicker. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, 156 U-boats were still operational. Of those, 146 survived the war intact, their crews ordered to surface and surrender rather than scuttle their boats. Among those survivors was U-537, her hull still bearing the scars from the March 25th attack that should have killed her. She was sailed to Britain under Allied control, where she was studied extensively before being scrapped in 1947. The men who'd served aboard her scattered to civilian life, carrying memories of cold water and close calls, of the smell of diesel and fear, of the sound of twin engines growing louder in hydrophone headsets. Some thrived in peacetime. Others struggled. A few never truly left the war behind, their dreams still haunted by the 18 seconds when death was coming, and all you could do was listen and hope you'd heard it soon enough. Karl Brenner died in 2001 at the age of 79. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his wartime service briefly, noting that he'd been a radioman aboard U-boats. It didn't mention his acoustic detection method, didn't explain that he'd saved lives through unauthorized innovation,
didn't tell the story of the young sonar man who'd heard what no one believed was possible and trusted his ears over his orders. But in the archives of naval warfare, in the classified reports and academic studies and technical manuals, his legacy endured. The principle he'd discovered, that human adaptability could counter technological advantage, that listening carefully could defeat precision weapons, that 18 seconds of warning was enough to cheat death, became foundational to submarine doctrine across the world.
The story of U-537 and the Mosquito wasn't about victory or defeat. It was about adaptation, about the eternal contest between new weapons and new defenses, about men trapped between the ocean's depths and the sky's hunters who learned that survival meant listening for sounds the manual said didn't exist. It was a reminder that in war, as in life, the most important knowledge often comes not from those who write the rules, but from those who must live or die by them. And sometimes, when everything official fails and doctrine offers nothing but death, the best thing you can do is trust the young man with headphones who says he can hear danger coming, even when everyone above him says he's wrong. Because 18 seconds of warning, based on sounds no one believed in, is the difference between a submarine that comes home and one that rests forever in the cold darkness of the North Sea. The manual said it was impossible. Reality proved otherwise. And in that gap between doctrine and survival, men like Karl Brenner wrote the lessons that outlived the war itself. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.